fire was supposed to be like any other. The Obi family, though not rich, found joy in the little things: laughter over simple meals, stories told under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, and the warmth of family love. But fate had other plans. In the dead of night, a spark from an old faulty wire ignited their wooden home. Flames swallowed the house in seconds, consuming everything within. Madame Ada awoke to the acrid smell of burning wood and the horrifying sight of the fire engulfing their home. Screams of terror filled the air as she tried to wake her husband and 3 children. But the flames were faster than her hands. One by one, she lost them: her husband's desperate cries, her children's terrified wails, until silence reigned, leaving only the crackling of the fire. By the time the neighbors arrived, all that remained of Madame Ada's world was ash and the single child she had managed to pull from the blaze: Pearl. The loss nearly drove Madame Ada to madness, but in her sorrow a new resolve was born. She would not allow Pearl to suffer the same fate as the rest of her family. She would do whatever it took to ensure her daughter had a future. With nothing but the clothes on her back and her child in her arms, she left the ruins of their past behind, stepping into an uncertain future. Lagos, the city of dreams and despair, became their new home. Madame Ada, once a dignified woman with a loving husband, found herself scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and doing any menial job available just to keep food on the table. They lived in a single room in the slums, where the walls were damp with years of neglect and the streets outside reeked of struggle. But none of it mattered. Her only concern was Pearl's future. Every naira she earned, she saved for Pearl's education. She sold every piece of jewelry she owned, every fine clothing she had left from her past life, just to keep Pearl in school. When the opportunity came for Pearl to attend Harmony Elite University, an institution meant for the privileged, Madame Ada did not hesitate. She took on a job as a live-in maid for a wealthy family, enduring endless insults, back-breaking labor, and sleepless nights. At only 35, she looked 50, her body bent from years of toil. But in her eyes, it was all worth it. Pearl would have a life better than hers. Pearl, on the other hand, was oblivious to the depth of her mother's sacrifices. All she saw was an embarrassing struggle, a mother who worked as a maid while other parents arrived in sleek cars. And as she stepped into the grand gates of Harmony Elite University, a world of affluence and privilege welcomed her with open arms, slowly pulling her away from the woman who gave her everything. At Harmony Elite University, Pearl was immediately overwhelmed by the opulence that surrounded her. The grand halls gleamed with marble floors, and chandeliers hung from the ceilings like dazzling crowns. Students arrived in chauffeur-driven cars, dressed in designer outfits that spoke of their generational wealth. Everything about the school was a stark contrast to the life she had known, and Pearl felt an intense desire to belong. She quickly caught the attention of Nicole, Tayo, and Stephanie, students from wealthy backgrounds who embodied everything she wished to be. They invited her into their circle, introducing her to a world of lavish parties, expensive brunches, and shopping sprees in high-end boutiques. At first, Pearl hesitated, but the temptation was too strong. She borrowed clothes, adopted their accents, and soon the girl from the slums transformed into someone new. But to maintain this new identity, she needed more money. She started asking Madame Ada for higher allowances, masking her demands with sweet words and false gratitude. Ada, exhausted from work but eager to please her daughter, complied. The struggle to send Pearl to school intensified, yet Pearl never once asked how her mother managed to provide. As Pearl's new life unfolded, so did her shame. She began avoiding calls from her mother, embarrassed by her humble roots. When her friends asked about her family, she lied, claiming her mother lived abroad. Each lie distanced her further from the truth and from the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. Months passed, and Pearl had fully settled into her new identity. She had mastered the art of deception, crafting a version of herself that fit seamlessly into the elite society of Harmony Elite University. Her mother's calls had become a nuisance, and eventually she stopped answering them altogether. Madame Ada, worried about her daughter's sudden silence, borrowed money to visit the school and see Pearl with her own eyes. The day she arrived, the campus was bustling with activity. Students dressed in their finest designer wear strolled the grounds, laughter and chatter filling the air. Madame Ada, dressed in her faded wrapper and worn slippers, stood out like a sore thumb. Yet she pressed on, determined to find her daughter. When she finally spotted Pearl standing with her wealthy friends, her heart swelled with joy. She rushed towards her, arms outstretched, eager to embrace the child she had sacrificed everything for. But before she could reach her, Pearl took a step back, a look of horror flashing across her face. "Who is this woman?" Nicole asked, eyeing Madame Ada with disdain. Pearl swallowed hard, her mind racing. Shame gripped her like a vice, and before she could stop herself, the words spilled out. "I don't know her," she said coldly. "She's probably some beggar looking for money." Madame Ada's face fell, her outstretched arms trembling. "Pearl, my daughter. It's me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Pearl's wealthy friends laughed, amused by the spectacle. "A beggar calling you her daughter? How ridiculous," Stephanie sneered. Unable to bear the humiliation, Pearl's shame turned to anger. "Get away from me, you cursed woman! You're embarrassing me," she spat, pushing her mother aside. The words hit Madame Ada like a blow to the chest. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She had given everything for this child, and now she was nothing to her. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked away, her soul shattered beyond repair. That night, alone in her tiny room, Madame Ada wept bitter tears, and with the last of her strength, she uttered the words that would change Pearl's life forever. "The child who shamed her mother will never know the joy of hearing a child call her mama." 2 weeks later, Madame Ada passed away, leaving behind a daughter who had no idea what she had just lost. Pearl had no idea her mother had died. She had continued her life as though nothing had happened, immersing herself deeper into the world of luxury and status. But something changed. Even in the midst of parties and expensive outings, she began to feel an unease she couldn't shake. At night, her sleep was plagued by nightmares. Her mother's tear-streaked face, the sound of her voice calling out, the look of pain when she had turned her away. Then one evening, she received a call from an unknown number. A distant relative, Madame Ada's neighbor, spoke in a hushed voice. "Pearl, your mother is gone." The words echoed in her ears. Her breath caught in her throat. "Gone? What do you mean?" "She died 2 weeks ago, alone." The weight of her actions crashed down on her, suffocating her with a pain she never imagined possible. The moment Pearl dropped the call, the walls of her perfectly crafted world started to collapse. A sharp pain clawed at her chest, suffocating her in a way she had never known before. The words repeated in her head. Her mother was gone, gone forever. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from what had to be a terrible dream, but reality was unyielding. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in her perfectly furnished apartment, surrounded by designer clothes and luxury perfumes. But as she turned to face the mirror, she no longer recognized the girl staring back. Her reflection looked hollow, empty, like something had been ripped from her soul. Days passed, but Pearl couldn't shake the heaviness in her heart. Her mother had died alone. Alone because Pearl had abandoned her. The thought twisted her insides, making her physically sick. She tried to drown the guilt in distractions, shopping, parties, expensive vacations, but nothing filled the void. The laughter of her friends sounded distant, their conversations meaningless. No one knew the truth behind her empty eyes, and she dared not tell them. Then came the nightmares. Every night, Pearl saw her mother. Sometimes, Madame Ada stood at the foot of her bed, staring with hollow eyes filled with sorrow. Other times, Pearl relived that fateful day, the moment she had turned her back on the woman who had given her everything. But the worst nightmares were the ones where she heard her mother's voice, whispering the curse over and over again. The child who shamed her mother will never know the joy of hearing a child call her mama. Pearl woke up, gasping, drenched in sweat. The words clung to her like a second skin, sinking deep into her soul. But it was just a nightmare, wasn't it? Just guilt playing tricks on her mind. Until the first signs appeared. Pearl had been married for a year when she started to worry. She and her husband, Kunla, had planned for a child almost immediately after their wedding, eager to build a family of their own. But months passed, then a year, and still there was no sign of pregnancy. At first she brushed it off, convinced it would happen in time. But as the second year approached, the whispers began. Kunla's family started asking questions. Friends began dropping subtle hints. Even Kunla, ever patient, started looking at her differently. Desperate, Pearl visited a doctor. She sat in the sterile office, her hands clammy as she awaited the results. The doctor entered, his face unreadable. He sat across from her, flipping through her file before finally speaking. "Mrs. Obi, we've run all the necessary tests," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm afraid the results show that you have a condition that makes it highly unlikely you'll ever conceive naturally." The room spun. Pearl's breath hitched. "No, that's not possible," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "There has to be a mistake. My mother, she had me." The doctor sighed. "I understand this is difficult, but the results are clear. I can recommend some specialists, but the chances are very slim." Pearl felt her world shatter all over again. As she walked out of the hospital, the weight of her mother's curse wrapped around her like an iron chain. The nightmares weren't just nightmares. The whispers weren't just guilt. The curse was real. And now, it was her turn to suffer. The funeral had already passed. There was no grave for Pearl to kneel before, no body to see one last time. Madame Ada had been buried quietly without the presence of the only person who should have been there, her daughter. The realization gnawed at Pearl, a slow, agonizing torment that refused to fade. She sat alone in her lavish apartment, surrounded by the material wealth she had once believed would bring her happiness. Designer bags lined the walls, expensive perfume sat untouched on the vanity, and the chandelier above her cast a golden glow over the emptiness of her life. But nothing felt luxurious anymore. Instead, her world seemed smaller, darker, like a prison built from her own greed and shame. The words of her mother's curse echoed in her mind every night. "The child who shamed her mother will never know the joy of hearing a child call her mama." At first she had dismissed them as the bitter words of a heartbroken woman. But now they haunted her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face, wrinkled with years of sacrifice, eyes filled with a love Pearl had so carelessly thrown away. And with each passing day, Pearl began to believe that her mother's final words were more than just a curse. They were a prophecy. Months passed, and Pearl's attempts to move on proved futile. She tried to convince herself that she was simply grieving, that time would heal her wounds. But as time stretched on, the weight of her guilt only grew heavier. She avoided her reflection, unable to look at the person she had become. Friends, once her greatest source of validation, felt like strangers. The laughter at high-end parties no longer sounded sweet, but hollow, like echoes in a vast emptiness. One evening, desperate for some sort of relief, she visited a church. It was a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of the city, far from the world she had crafted for herself. As she sat in the dimly lit hall, listening to the choir's mournful hymns, she felt something crack inside her. The weight of her sins pressed down on her, and before she knew it, hot tears streamed down her face. She wanted to pray, but she didn't know how. She wanted to ask for forgiveness, but who was left to grant it? Her mother was gone because Pearl had abandoned her. As she sat there, trembling with sorrow, a woman in the pew ahead of her turned around. She was older, with soft, kind eyes that reminded Pearl too much of Madame Ada. The woman reached out and gently took Pearl's hands in hers. "Child," she said, her voice soothing, "whatever burdens you carry, lay them down. No sin is too great to be forgiven." But Pearl wasn't sure if that was true. Could she ever be free from the shadow of her own betrayal? Or was this her fate, to carry the weight of her mother's last words for the rest of her life? Days turned into weeks, and Pearl found herself trapped in a cycle of regret and self-loathing. The news of her mother's death had shattered the illusion she had built around herself. No longer did the designer clothes or extravagant parties bring her joy. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw not the polished young woman she had fought to become, but a daughter who had abandoned the one person who truly loved her. She tried to push the guilt aside, burying herself in schoolwork and social events, but her mother's words haunted her. The child who shamed her mother will never know the joy of hearing a child call her mama. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than the words of a broken-hearted woman, but as time went on, an unsettling fear crept into her mind. What if the curse was real? Determined to silence her conscience, Pearl focused on securing a bright future. She graduated with top honors and landed a prestigious job in a multinational firm. With her intelligence and beauty, she quickly climbed the corporate ladder, earning the wealth and recognition she had always dreamed of. But beneath the surface, an emptiness gnawed at her soul. Success had come at a cost, and the one person who should have been there to celebrate her achievements was gone. As the years passed, Pearl found love, or at least she thought she did. She married a wealthy businessman, and for a while life seemed perfect. But happiness was fleeting. After years of trying, she remained childless. Doctors ran tests, prescribed treatments, and offered reassurances. But nothing changed. The same woman who had mocked her mother for being cursed was now desperate for the one thing she could never have. One night, as she lay in bed beside her husband, she found herself whispering, "Mama, forgive me." Tears rolled down her face as she realized the full weight of her mother's final words. No amount of wealth or success could erase what she had done. The curse was not just a string of bitter words. It was the echo of a mother's pain, and it had settled deep into Pearl's fate. Her husband, frustrated with their childlessness, grew distant. The once loving marriage crumbled under the weight of resentment. Eventually, he left, taking with him not just their dreams of a family, but the last shred of happiness Pearl had clung to. Alone in her luxurious apartment, surrounded by everything she had once thought she wanted, she finally understood. She had traded a mother's love for a fleeting illusion, and now she was paying the ultimate price. Desperation led her to places she never thought she'd go. She sought out spiritualists, pastors, and traditional healers, all in search of a way to undo the curse. But no one could help her. "A mother's tears are powerful," one elderly woman told her. "You cannot outrun them." For the first time in her life, Pearl truly understood what it meant to be helpless. She had everything, and yet she had nothing. And deep in her heart, she knew there was no escaping the price of shame. Pearl sat alone in her luxurious apartment, staring at the rain-streaked window. The emptiness inside her grew heavier with each passing day. Her wealth and status had brought her everything she once desired, except peace. The silence of her home was deafening, and the curse of her mother's words haunted her every waking moment. She had tried to love, to build a family, but love never stayed. 2 failed marriages had left her broken, with each husband walking away when the doctors confirmed what she already feared. She was barren. The realization that her mother's words had come true made her stomach churn with guilt. She had turned her back on the one person who had given her everything, and now no amount of tears could bring Madame Ada back. One evening, she visited the neighborhood where they once lived. The single room they had shared was now occupied by another struggling family, and the pain of what she had abandoned cut through her like a blade. She walked to the small cemetery where her mother was buried, her hands trembling as she traced the rough edges of the tombstone. "Mama, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was blind, I was foolish, and now I have nothing." The wind howled, as if mocking her late apology. Pearl fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, but no matter how much she cried, no voice answered her. Her mother was gone, and so was any chance of making things right. Years passed, but the weight of her actions never lessened. Pearl lived in luxury, but every corner of her mansion felt like a prison. She had power, influence, and wealth, yet none of it could erase the gaping void in her heart. She had wanted to be part of the elite, to leave her past behind, but now her past was the only thing she longed for. She dedicated herself to charity, funding education for poor children, hoping to atone for her sins. She built a foundation in her mother's name, but deep down she knew no amount of good deeds could undo the pain she had caused. One evening, as she sat on her balcony, watching the sun set over the city, she whispered, "Mama, I wish I had one more chance." But fate never grants second chances. The price of shame had already been paid, and Pearl would carry its weight until the end of her days.